Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, September 23rd, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the state of North Carolina and the governor's race that is currently between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, as the Republican nominee for governor here, Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, sees 4 of his key and crucial campaign staffers resigning amidst an array of scandals that have ultimately doomed this candidacy to a point where there is little to no chance the Republican Party wins this governor election this coming November. Now, it isn't normally too much news to talk about resignations from campaign staff. They actually do happen far more often than you might think. But it comes at a time where the North Carolina governor's race was already in a position where Democrats were on track to win the race by a pretty significant amount, and then these scandals came into play. And now, Mark Robinson is in an even worse off position than before, given the fact that some of his very close advisors and people that were integral in making his campaign get this far in the first place have all decided that they are leaving the race. And the actual list of staffers that have decided to resign here is a bit more extensive than just the 4, right? It is reported on by local press in the state of North Carolina that the campaign staff has really narrowed down to having just 3 staffers across the entire state. I mean, we were at a point where North Carolina's governor race on the Republican side really has been almost entirely abandoned. Democrats are set to spend $10 million over the next 2.5 months, or rather 1.5 months. The Republican Party has less than $200,000 allocated here. But the point being that those who resigned from the Mark Robinson campaign, again, weren't just these low-level staffers. You are talking about a senior advisor, the finance director, the person directly responsible for raising money and spending money, the deputy campaign manager, and get this, yes, his own campaign manager also resigning from the campaign. Everyone who has been close to Mark Robinson has decided that this was too much for them. They decided that this race was no longer winnable, and all of them are deciding that they are now going to take a step back and leave his candidacy. And Mark Robinson was in a position where he was already on track to lose. As I was saying, the polling data was pretty clear that in North Carolina, it was very much going to be a Josh Stein victory. But it is these recent scandals that really solidify this fact and really go to show that the Republicans made the wrong choice in Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, something that honestly we predicted very earlier on, but ultimately the Republican Party made that decision and very much now is regretting it. And Mark Robinson, too, I think, never really gave any chance for his mistakes or past to be rectified really to any degree. He was insistent in denying the accusations, the scandal that released, even though almost everyone close to him and almost everyone across the state who has heard of it genuinely believes to be true, because it looks very much like it is very much true. We are in a position where Mark Robinson isn't in a position, I keep saying position, but isn't in a circumstance where he could reasonably deny it. I mean, there is evidence upon evidence point upon evidence point that really tie him to all of the comments that were made, all of the actions that were done, and that does a lot of damage to somebody who's running in a state that is normally competitive with just normal Republican and Democratic nominees. Now, Republicans are going to have to combat the fact that they are facing a candidate who is strong on their own right. Attorney General Josh Stein is someone who has been elected statewide and knows how to win statewide, not to mention the fact that Mark Robinson is just so exceptionally scandal-plagued at this point in time. I don't see a pathway forward in which he wins the governor election. I really think we're in a position where this race is wraps and is really a done deal, and now it's about the damage that this governor race does to the up-ballot races. I'm thinking the presidential race. I'm thinking also other down-ballot races, congressional races, state legislative races, races where the Republican Party could be losing their supermajority in the state legislature, where they could be losing a congressional seat because of the fact that Mark Robinson is dragging down Republicans up across the ballot. And potentially the worst case scenario here for Republicans is that they lose the presidential election in North Carolina because Mark Robinson turns out enough Democrats to turn out against the Republican Party as a whole. And so Mark Robinson, I think, navigating this race has never really been a position where he was vetted extensively by the GOP. I think there were a number of missteps that really came into light immediately after he won the nomination. We saw that the day after he won the GOP nomination, the Democratic Party ran ads releasing a tape they acquired of Mark Robinson saying he wishes he could go back in time to a day and age where women did not have the right to vote. That is who Republicans were working with, and the fact remains, many of them also knew about a lot of these scandals. Many of them go back to the 2020 election when he was running for lieutenant governor. Nobody made a big deal of it. The Republican Party didn't reject it. They didn't go ahead and push him out of this race, and they could have done that for a variety of different reasons. Maybe they thought, because this is the worst of the worst and he still was able to win, it really didn't matter to voters. But what they are finding out very harshly and very quickly is that not only does it matter to voters, it matters to campaign staff who are now saying that they are resigning from this campaign at large. And I think that's really where the Republican Party made a number of miscalculations, and that more that came out is going to be in a position that, ultimately dooms the candidacy, ultimately dooms the chances of victory, and nobody wants to be a part of a losing campaign. And so that's why, again, you're seeing campaign manager, deputy campaign manager, finance director, senior advisor. It's pretty consistent here that all of these people who are, again, close to Mark Robinson are deciding, I'm not going to run. And so I want us to take a look at a similar scenario where this happened back in 2022. We actually saw something similar in Georgia's Senate race. We're not going to talk about that too heavily, but Herschel Walker saw a number of people depart from his race after a significant number of scandals were released by his son, by members of his family, things that were unsealed and given to the press. We saw a lot of people depart from the Herschel Walker campaign, but that was actually a lot closer. I think a better comparison for this point is Doug Mastriano, who ran for governor back in Pennsylvania in 2022. He was a state senator. He was someone who had won in a district before, but he was someone who had a lot of scandal to his name. And Democrats really wanted him to be the Republican nominee for governor because they knew he would be the easiest one to beat, right? There was a former U.S. representative who honestly could have given Josh Shapiro a better run for his money than what Doug Mastriano was able to do, but what the Democratic Party did was so exceptionally calculated that it really did pay off in the general election. And so what it looked like was running advertisements that were in a way boosting Doug Mastriano, whether calling him too conservative or too associated with Donald Trump. Anytime the Democratic Party does that in a general election, in a primary season, it's always to boost that candidate that in theory they are attacking. It's sort of this idea that if you tell Republicans that we don't want this person as Democrats, the Republicans will want that candidate more. And it really does work. It ultimately led to Doug Mastriano receiving the endorsement from Donald Trump and consequently winning the Republican primary. But as we came closer to the general election season, the polls initially started out being close because people didn't know much about Doug Mastriano. Pennsylvania, at heart, is a close and competitive state. We know that Pennsylvania is a state that does swing back and forth. Obama won it, then Trump won it, then Biden won it, and now it's a toss-up, right? Really 60-40 odds right now in favor of Kamala Harris, but very much a toss-up. And in 2022, it was a similar thing. We didn't know much about Doug Mastriano. Voters, at least, did not know much across the state of Pennsylvania. And it was on the Democratic Party to characterize him as someone who was seen as too extreme for the party. What we saw in Pennsylvania in the gubernatorial race is that Doug Mastriano, what came out after he won the primary, was that he attended the January 6th insurrection. Beyond that, too, what came out as well was the fact that he was very much anti-abortion. Very much in a day and age where you cannot have that position in a battleground state, he was opposed to pro-choice movements, opposed to a woman's right to choose. And so what happened? Voters rejected him. But it was a variety of different topics. I mean, he is someone who has leaned into conspiracy theory before, had made extremist comments before. He is somebody who across the state of Pennsylvania was just simply not the right fit. And he was an election denialist. He refused to concede the 2020 election, refused to acknowledge any and all results that were in opposition to what he believed in. And so it was fascinating to watch, the Democratic Party characterize him for all the things he had done. Nothing was fabricated. Nothing was misconstrued. This was just Doug Mastriano's comments and past history that allowed him to do well in the Republican primary, but ultimately lost him the general election. And we saw that happen really over time. Josh Shapiro only had a 2.9% advantage throughout the entire month of June and leading into July until the Democratic Party again made a concerted effort in showing people who Doug Mastriano was. A lot of this really was just playing the ads of him speaking, playing the ads of comments being read from his perspective. These are things that really landed negatively for the average voter in Pennsylvania. And what happened? They changed their mind. Instead of it being a three-way race of Shapiro versus Mastriano, it became a 7-point race, then an 8-point race, then a 9-point race, and then it slightly tightened. But then it started to expand, and it remained in the double digits through Election Day to 10.4%. And what happened? Not only was it 10.4%, we saw Pennsylvania underestimate Democrats in 2022, it was 15%, 14.9% across the state, 14.8% rather, across the state of Pennsylvania, 14.8% in a state that Biden only won by 1.2%. And so it was an overestimation for the Republican Party when it came down to the margin here. But again, it speaks to this point where the race was initially narrower and certainly was in a position where people didn't know how it was going to go. Mark Robinson, to be fair, was leading in a lot of the preliminary polling, but ultimately came up short in recent polling. Why? Because voters have gotten to know Mark Robinson for who he is on a much more intimate level than what the Republican campaign can afford to win on. And that's why they're losing. Mark Robinson has said and done things that really turn off the average swing voter, and there are a lot of swing voters in North Carolina. That is why it is so competitive. And when you take a look at the margin over time, again, it expanded from being a Mark Robinson victory to Josh Stein being ahead by 2 or 3 points, occasionally was up, but then Mark Robinson took the lead in a set of new polls. Then the Democratic Party really hammered it in. The primary happened. They spent millions of dollars on advertisements. It went Stein plus 1, 6, 5, 14, 11, and then it continued till now where he is up on average by 9.5% against Mark Robinson. The Democrats are in a really strong position, and guess what? The most recent poll we see from the New York Times and Siena College. What do they tell us? That Josh Stein leads by 10 points. Now, this poll was conducted in the middle of the scandal being released. So not everyone was able to really, acquire all the knowledge or insight about this scandal here. But what do we notice immediately? That it went from Stein plus 7 on Carolina Journal, Stein plus 8 on the Hill and Emerson College. And then in the middle of this poll, there's a huge boost here for Josh Stein, bumps up to Josh Stein plus 10. I can imagine that future polls that would be conducted entirely past time for advertisements to be ran on this topic, people to read the paper, people to see it on the news, all of these different things. It's now going to be at a point where Josh Stein will likely be up by 11, 12, 13, 14 points, and maybe on Election Day sees a margin similar to that of Josh Shapiro in the Pennsylvania governor's race in the state of North Carolina. And so what that really means for the down ballot races and arguably even the presidential race is that Republicans really don't have much else to rely on to carry Republicans out to the ballot box. What they've historically thought was good was that because the North Carolina governor's race was coinciding with the presidential, North Carolina voters actually lean a bit more conservative when it comes down to races that aren't the presidential race. In 2022, we saw that Republicans won the Senate seat by 3 times the amount that Donald Trump beat Joe Biden in 2020 in North Carolina. What we've seen in years like 2014 and arguably even 2018. North Carolina does, in fact, lean more towards the right. And so they'd think that having a gubernatorial race where Republicans could organize on their own separately and across the state might actually make voters more inclined to vote for Donald Trump. If they're voting for Republicans anyway down the ballot, why not vote for Donald Trump at the top of the ticket? But that is simply not the case. And not only that, Democrats have essentially taken away the one primary opportunity for Republicans to turn out voters. Why? Because there isn't a competitive Senate race in North Carolina right now. There was one in 2022 and there was one in 2020, but there isn't one this cycle. The House races are gerrymandered, meaning that there aren't going to be as many investments in battleground seats, as many people on the ground turning out Democratic and Republican Party voters, and there isn't really much of an urgency surrounding the congressional races on that note. And even beyond that, too, you can see many of the other races here. Republicans hold some of these Supreme Court justice seats. They aren't necessarily worried about those. Republicans currently hold the advantage in the state legislature, holding a supermajority. They gerrymandered it so much, the only 2 options from November could be a majority or a supermajority for the Republican Party. 0% chance Democrats win any type of majority in either state legislative chamber. And so North Carolina really had a lot going for them, arguably, would have a lot more going for them if the Republicans had a stellar candidate on the GOP, on the gubernatorial front, because then they could turn out voters for that candidate, even if some of these voters were not thrilled to vote for Donald Trump in the first place. And when he was up against Biden, the numbers looked a lot better than they look today. But at the end of the day, that's not something that we're really taking into calculation right now, because based on where we are at, when it comes down to polls of Josh Stein versus Mark Robinson, it's easy to see how this race will be called likely within the first hour of polls closing in this battleground state. And so now that everyone has decided they're up and out of the Mark Robinson campaign, I think things are honestly going to get even worse. The fact that they are deciding to really leave in a time where the campaign can't afford any more losses really shows that this ship is not only sinking, but it sank a long, long time ago. And then any type of effort and any type of recovery efforts to really save this have completely failed, now that everybody who would even have a stake in the game has decided to leave the candidate on his own. And I think this really also, too, came at a point where Mark Robinson decided he was not going to drop out of the race. I honestly did think that some of these comments that were released really were leaked on the day that someone could drop out of the gubernatorial race in North Carolina and have anyone replaced by their name according to a vote in the North Carolina GOP. It's a convoluted process, but it could have happened because they wanted Mark Robinson to drop out. And we saw pressure from the Trump team. We saw pressure from the North Carolina GOP to push him out of the race privately. But publicly, they backed him. Publicly, they stood by Mark Robinson. And so what that means is that Mark Robinson was given a green light to stay in the race. But everyone knew that was the wrong choice. It would have been a much better choice for the North Carolina Republican Party if they swapped him out for somebody else. If they told him, you need to go. You are losing us this race and might even lose us the presidential election in North Carolina, if not on the national level, because of the impact of the 16 electoral votes that North Carolina has. But quite frankly, it seems not only does he not care, he believes that he is sticking it to the man by staying in the race. He believes he is pushing back on the left wing, on the right wing establishment, on voters who want him out of the race by staying in the race. It's a calculus that I think is unlike anybody who has genuine political instincts, but ultimately, this is his decision to make. And the decision he is making is that he will not drop out, despite many of these comments and scandals that have been released. Mark Robinson is convinced, and his campaign released a statement, that polls underestimate Republicans and that North Carolina will be voting for Mark Robinson this November 5th. But we all know that just simply is not the case. Mark Robinson is likely wish casting at this point, but his candidacy has been far, far, far doomed from practically the very beginning. But especially after this, there's no possible pathway forward, and his campaign staff are entirely up and out. And so I'm interested to see what this final margin ends up being. We've come to a point where this North Carolina governor's race should be characterized as safe Democrat, by a percent chance the Democrats win it. The margin is getting close to being a safe Democratic seat. North Carolina is in an interesting position because it historically is much more competitive, but with the wrong Republican and the right Democrat, it's clear what wonders can be done for the Democratic Party in battleground states like this one, which will likely translate to Democrats winning by double digits this November against Republican Mark Robinson. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, then a playlist for my 2024 governor election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.